The light was dying when I carried the laundry basket down the hallway that afternoon. Golden hour light, they call it. That soft amber glow that photographers chase and poets write about. It filtered through the windows of our colonial home like honey through gauze, casting everything in that particular warmth that makes ordinary moments feel profound. The television murmured something about weekend weather from the living room, a distant soundtrack to the domestic rhythm I had perfected over 17 years of marriage. I had always found comfort in these quiet suburban afternoons. Victor was in Chicago until Sunday, 3 days of marketing conferences that would bore me to tears but energized him in ways I never quite understood. Our daughter Emma was at her girlfriend's house, probably doing the things 17-year-olds do when they think they're invisible to the adult world. The house belonged to me alone, except it didn't. Not today. The guest room door stood slightly ajar, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the sound coming from within, not quite rustling, but the deliberate turning of pages. Slow, careful, the kind of sound someone makes when they're looking at something they shouldn't be. I paused in the hallway, basket balanced against my hip, and listened. The hardwood floor creaked beneath my bare feet. I had meant to fix that loose board for months, but like so many small repairs in my life, I had let it wait. Now it announced my presence whether I wanted it to or not. Adrian had arrived 3 days earlier with a single suitcase, and that smile I remembered from college, the one that always made him look like he was keeping a secret. We were 41 now, both of us carrying the particular weight that settles on men our age, the accumulated gravity of choices made and unmade. His hair had thinned at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when we were young and believed we had forever to figure everything out. He had texted me 6 weeks earlier, completely out of nowhere. Conference in Boston, he'd written. Any chance I could crash for a few nights? Like old times. I had said yes before consulting my calendar, before asking Victor, before considering what it might mean to have Adrian in our house for the first time since Emma was a toddler. The response felt automatic, muscle memory from a friendship that had once been the most important relationship in my life. The page turning stopped. I shifted the basket to my other hip and stepped closer to the door. Through the gap, I could see a slice of the guest room, the white bedspread Emma and I had picked out at Target, the small oak dresser that had been my grandmother's, and there, hunched over something on the bed, was Adrian. He was shirtless. This shouldn't have mattered. We had been roommates senior year. I had seen him shirtless countless times, stumbling to the shower at dawn, changing clothes before dinner, sleeping off hangovers in the heat of our unair-conditioned apartment. But something about seeing him now, in my house, in the carefully curated space where my family lived and breathed and existed, made my pulse quicken in a way I couldn't name. What held my attention, though, wasn't his bare shoulders or the way the afternoon light caught the silver threading through the hair on his chest. It was what he was holding, an old photo album, burgundy leather, worn at the corners, with pages that had grown brittle with age. I had forgotten it existed. My mother had given it to me years ago, back when she was cleaning out her house before moving to the retirement community in Florida. Pictures from college, she had said. I thought you might want them someday. I had glanced through it once, briefly, then tucked it away in the guest room closet behind extra blankets and Christmas decorations. Out of sight, out of mind. Now Adrian was turning its pages with the deliberate attention of someone reading a love letter. His head was bent forward, dark hair falling across his forehead the way it used to when he studied too late in the library. I could see the concentration in his posture, the careful way his fingers touched the plastic sleeves protecting photographs I hadn't looked at in probably a decade. I should have backed away. Should have called out, given him a chance to close the album and put on his shirt before I entered. Should have respected the privacy he clearly thought he had in my guest room. Instead, I knocked twice on the doorframe, gentle, polite, and pushed the door open before waiting for an answer. Adrian's head snapped up. Our eyes met across the small space, and something electric passed between us. Not attraction, exactly, though that was part of it. Something deeper and more complicated. Recognition, maybe, or remembrance. He was holding the album open to a page I couldn't see clearly from where I stood, but I could tell from his expression that it wasn't just any collection of college photos. His face had gone very still, the way faces do when someone realizes they've been caught doing something they can't easily explain. I'm sorry, I said, the words tumbling out too quickly. I didn't realize you were. I was just bringing up clean towels. It was a lie. The towels were already in the guest bathroom, had been since the morning he arrived. But lies came easily when the truth felt too complicated to navigate. Adrian closed the album carefully, his movements deliberate despite the obvious startlement. He reached for his t-shirt, which was draped over the chair beside the bed, and pulled it over his head without breaking eye contact. The gesture should have been casual, unremarkable. Instead, it felt intimate in a way that made me want to look away. "No problem," he said, but his voice carried a strange weight. "I was just looking at old pictures. Hope you don't mind." "Of course not," I replied, though we both knew that wasn't entirely true. The album wasn't meant for casual browsing. It was the kind of thing you put away precisely because you didn't want to stumble across it during ordinary moments. I set the laundry basket down on the dresser and pretended to busy myself with the towels that didn't need adjusting. The silence stretched between us, heavy with things neither of us was willing to name. In my peripheral vision, I could see Adrian sitting on the edge of the bed, the album closed beside him, his hands resting on his knees. "I'll leave you to it," I said finally, picking up the empty basket. "Dinner's at 7, if you're hungry." He nodded, but still didn't quite meet my eyes. Something had shifted in the room, some fundamental change in the quality of the air between us. When I pulled the door closed behind me, I heard him release a breath he seemed to have been holding. I stood in the hallway for a long moment, basket in hand, listening to the sound of my own heartbeat. The house felt different somehow, charged with an energy I couldn't identify. Through the guest room door, I heard the soft sound of pages turning again, and I knew Adrian had reopened the album. That evening, we sat across from each other at the dining room table I had inherited from Victor's mother, eating takeout Thai food from containers that were still warm from the restaurant. I had thought about cooking something special, the way I used to when we were young and dinner was an event worth celebrating. But the afternoon had left me feeling unsteady, unsure of my own motivations. Adrian was different at dinner. He talked too much, filling every silence with stories about his work, his apartment in Portland, the conference he was attending. He poured himself a second glass of wine, then a third, drinking with the focused intensity of someone trying to quiet something in his own head. When I asked him about the photos, he laughed too loudly and said they brought back memories. When I asked what kind of memories, he changed the subject to Emma's college applications, then to Victor's business trips, then to the weather forecast for the weekend. By the time we finished eating, the careful distance he was maintaining felt like a physical thing. He helped me clear the table, standing just far enough away that our hands wouldn't accidentally touch when we both reached for the same plate. When I offered coffee, he said he was tired and thought he'd turn in early. I watched him walk down the hallway toward the guest room, noting the slight hesitation in his step when he passed the family photos lining the walls. Pictures of Victor and me on our wedding day, Emma's school portraits through the years, vacation shots from beaches and mountains and cities we had visited as a family. The visual evidence of a life lived steadily, predictably, without the dramatic upheavals that make for interesting stories. After he closed the guest room door, I sat in the living room with a book I couldn't concentrate on, listening to the sounds of him moving around in the room above, water running in the bathroom, footsteps across the floor, the squeak of bed springs as he settled in for the night. It wasn't until much later, when the house had gone completely quiet, that I allowed myself to think about what I had seen in his face when our eyes met that afternoon. It wasn't embarrassment at being caught shirtless or awkwardness at being found looking through old photos. It was something much more dangerous than that. It was the look of someone who had been caught remembering something he had tried very hard to forget. I have always been what people call a settled man. 17 years of marriage will do that to you, I suppose. Teach you the rhythms of a shared life, the careful choreography of two people moving through the same spaces without collision. Victor and I have perfected this dance over nearly 2 decades. He leaves for work at 7:30 sharp, coffee in a travel mug, briefcase in one hand, keys already jingling in the other. I follow an hour later, after Emma catches her ride to school, and I've straightened the kitchen and started the dishwasher and checked that all the windows are locked. We live in a colonial on Maple Street in Lexington, Massachusetts, the kind of neighborhood where people know each other's dogs' names and wave from their driveways on Saturday mornings. The house has good bones, as the realtor said when we bought it 15 years ago. Crown molding, hardwood floors, a kitchen that gets morning light. Emma grew up here, learned to walk in the living room, celebrated birthdays in the backyard under the oak tree that's probably older than the house itself. My days follow patterns I've carved deep as riverbeds. I teach American literature at Brookfield Academy, a small private school where the students call me Mr. Brennan and write essays about Gatsby and Holden Caulfield that reveal more about their own longings than they realize. I've been there 11 years now, long enough to see my first students graduate college and start careers of their own. Long enough to know which faculty meetings matter and which ones I can skip without consequence. At home, I slice fruit for breakfast every morning. Apples in winter, berries in summer, whatever's fresh and seasonal. I listen to Miles Davis while I grade papers at the kitchen table, red pen moving across student analyses of symbolism and theme. I fix things that break. Leaky faucets, squeaky hinges, the loose board in the hallway that I keep meaning to nail down properly. On Sundays, Victor and I have dinner at 6 o'clock sharp, usually something I've spent the afternoon preparing while he reads the newspaper or watches golf on television. We attend couples therapy every other Thursday at 4:30 with Dr. Reeves, a kind woman with gray hair and knowing eyes who asks us to practice active listening and express our feelings using I statements. Victor is good at this. He talks about wanting to maintain our connection, about the importance of keeping romance alive after so many years together. He brings up the weekend trips we should take, the restaurants we should try, the conversations we should have more often. I nod and agree and say the right things about commitment and partnership and growing together instead of growing apart. But there's something hollow in these sessions, something that feels like going through the motions of intimacy rather than actually experiencing it. Dr. Reeves assigns us exercises, date nights, gratitude practices, bedroom conversations without electronics. We complete them dutifully, like homework assignments for a class we're both taking but neither of us really wants to be in. The truth is that our marriage isn't unhappy. Victor is a good man, steady and reliable and genuinely devoted to Emma and me. He remembers anniversaries and birthdays, brings me coffee in bed on weekend mornings, kisses me goodbye every day before work. He's never raised his voice in anger, never forgotten an important event, never made me feel unloved or unwanted. But somewhere along the way, we stopped asking each other the questions that matter. When did you last feel truly alive? What do you dream about when you let your mind wander? What would you do differently if you could start over? Victor never asks these things, and I never offer the answers. We exist in parallel lines, close enough to touch, but somehow never quite meeting. I find myself lingering in moments that shouldn't require lingering. Standing too long at the bathroom mirror in the morning, studying the face that's aged into something I still don't entirely recognize as my own. Pausing over old photographs when I'm cleaning out drawers, pictures of Victor and me from our early years together when everything felt possible and nothing felt settled. Watching strangers on the street who walk too close to each other, whose body language suggests secrets and urgency, and all the things that seem to have leached out of my own life. Sometimes I drive home from work by way of the college campus where Adrian and I spent 4 years learning how to be adults. I tell myself I'm avoiding traffic, but really I'm looking for something I can't name. The dormitories look smaller than I remember, the quad more cramped, the whole place somehow diminished by time and perspective. But occasionally I'll see two students walking together with that particular intensity that young friendships have, that sense of the world being large and full of possibility, and I'll feel something stir in my chest that I thought I'd lost years ago. Emma is 17 now, a senior preparing for college applications and the long goodbye that comes with growing up. She looks like Victor but moves like me, with a careful deliberation that suggests she's always thinking several steps ahead. She's been dating the same girl, Sophia, for 8 months now, and I watch them together with something approaching envy. Not for their youth, exactly, but for the way they look at each other, like they're seeing something the rest of the world is missing. When Adrian texted 6 weeks ago, asking if he could stay for a few nights, I felt that same stirring I get when I drive past the campus. Like a door I hadn't even noticed was closed had suddenly opened a crack, letting in light from a room I'd forgotten existed. I said yes immediately, surprising even myself with how quickly the word came. Now, lying in bed next to Victor on the night after Adrian looked up from that photo album, and our eyes met across the guest room, I realize how long it's been since I felt that particular kind of anticipation. Not the gentle contentment of a well-ordered life, but something sharper and more dangerous. Something that makes sleep feel impossible and the morning feel both too far away and too close. The text had come on a Tuesday evening in early October, while I was grading midterm essays at the kitchen table. Emma was upstairs doing calculus homework. Victor was in his study reviewing quarterly reports, and the house had settled into its familiar evening quiet. My phone buzzed against the wood, and when I glanced at the screen, I saw a name I hadn't seen there in months. Adrian Walsh. Conference in Boston next month, the message read. Any chance I could crash for a few nights? Like old times. I stared at the words for a long moment, fork suspended halfway between my mouth and the leftover pasta I was eating for dinner. Like old times. What did that even mean anymore? We were 41, not 21. We had mortgages and responsibilities and lives that had grown around us like careful gardens, cultivated over years of small decisions and daily routines. But I typed back yes before I could think too hard about what it might mean to have Adrian in our house again. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon, pulling up in a rental car while I was raking leaves in the front yard. The October light was sharp and clean, the kind of autumn day that makes New England feel like a postcard of itself. He climbed out of the car with that same easy smile I remembered, though his face carried more weight now, lines around his eyes that spoke of years I knew nothing about. We embraced briefly, the kind of careful hug that old friends give when they're not sure how much intimacy time has erased. He felt solid against me, broader through the shoulders than I remembered, and for just a moment I caught the scent of his cologne, something woody and unfamiliar that made me realize how much about him had changed. That first evening, we sat on the back porch with a bottle of wine and talked about safe things. His work as a graphic designer in Portland. My teaching. Emma's college applications. Victor's latest promotion. The conversation felt like walking on ice, both of us careful not to step too heavily on any particular memory or moment. I showed him around the house like a proud homeowner, pointing out the renovations we'd done over the years. The kitchen backsplash Victor and I had installed ourselves one weekend, arguing over every tile. The study where I graded papers and wrote lesson plans, lined with books I'd been collecting since graduate school. The garage where I kept my woodworking tools, half-finished projects gathering dust on workbenches. Adrian nodded and made appropriate sounds of appreciation, but I caught him looking at things with a strange expression, as if he was seeing not just the house as it was, but some other version of it. Some other version of me. On Friday evening, we opened a second bottle of wine, and the conversation grew looser, more familiar. We talked about people we'd known in college, professors we'd loved and hated, parties we'd attended, and embarrassing things we'd done. The years seemed to fall away with each shared memory, until we were laughing at stories I hadn't thought about in decades. That's when it happened. Adrian was telling me about a disastrous date he'd been on recently, some story involving a restaurant fire alarm and a woman who collected vintage mannequins. He was gesturing widely with his wine glass, eyes bright with laughter, and when he reached the punchline, he leaned against my shoulder for support, overcome by his own amusement. The contact was brief, maybe 3 seconds. His weight against me, warm and solid and completely natural. But something electric passed between us in that moment, some recognition that made my entire body go very still. I felt the warmth of his shoulder through his shirt, caught the sound of his breathing as his laughter subsided, became aware of my own heartbeat in a way that felt dangerous. Adrian must have felt it too, because he pulled away quickly, color rising in his cheeks. He cleared his throat and reached for his wine glass, avoiding my eyes. The easy flow of conversation stuttered and stopped. "I'm tired," he said, though it was barely 9 o'clock. "I think I'll turn in." He left me alone on the porch with the remains of our dinner and 2 half-empty wine glasses, the autumn air suddenly feeling too thin to breathe properly. The next morning, I found the letter. I was making coffee before Adrian woke up, moving quietly through the kitchen in bare feet and pajama pants. On the counter was one of his books, something about design theory that he'd been reading the night before. It had fallen open to a page near the back, and there, tucked between the pages like a bookmark, was an envelope with my own handwriting on it. My hands shook as I pulled it out and recognized what it was. A letter I had written 20 years ago and never sent. A letter I thought I had thrown away or lost or buried so deep it would never resurface. I didn't need to open it to remember what it said. The words were burned into my memory from the night I wrote them. Sitting in our cramped apartment senior year, while Adrian slept in his room down the hall. I had described that evening when he fell asleep in my bed after we'd both had too much wine. How I lay awake beside him for hours, listening to him breathe, fighting the urge to touch his shoulder or turn toward him or do any of the things that would have changed everything between us. In the letter, I had written the words I could never say out loud. I thought I loved you then, but I told myself it was just nostalgia. Just the intensity of youth and friendship and the fear of growing up and growing apart. I folded the letter and slid it back between the pages of his book, my hands trembling with something that might have been panic or relief or both. Adrian must have found it somewhere, maybe in a box of college things or an old jacket pocket. Must have kept it all these years. Must have brought it with him. When he came downstairs an hour later, showered and dressed, and carrying himself with careful normalcy, he didn't mention the book or the letter or anything that had happened the night before. We ate breakfast and read sections of the newspaper and talked about his conference schedule as if nothing had shifted between us. But that evening, when Victor called from Chicago to check in, Adrian left the room while I was on the phone. And at dinner, he barely touched his food. And when I suggested we sit on the porch again, he said he had emails to catch up on and disappeared into the guest room. Something had come undone, just as I'd sensed that first afternoon when our eyes met across the room. The careful distance we'd maintained for 20 years was collapsing, and neither of us knew how to stop it. The awareness crept in like a tide I hadn't noticed rising until it was already around my ankles. I began walking in the evenings, telling Adrian I needed air, telling myself I needed exercise. But really I was trying to untangle something that had gotten twisted inside me, some knot I'd tied so long ago I'd forgotten it was there. The neighborhood looked different during these walks, familiar streets transformed by the slant of late afternoon light. I found myself noticing things I'd walked past for 15 years without seeing. The way Mr. Henderson from 3 houses down tended his roses with such careful attention, deadheading spent blooms with the precision of a surgeon. The sound of the Williamson children playing in their backyard, their laughter carrying on the evening air like something from another lifetime. The soft yellow glow spilling from kitchen windows where other families were gathering for dinner, lives continuing their predictable rhythms, while mine felt increasingly unmoored. I walked for an hour each evening while Adrian remained at the house, and when I returned, I would find him in different rooms, as if he too was restless but didn't want to leave. Sometimes he was in the living room, reading one of Victor's business magazines with apparent fascination. Sometimes in the kitchen, washing dishes that didn't need washing or organizing spice jars that were already perfectly arranged. Once I found him standing in my study, running his fingers along the spines of books I'd collected over decades of teaching, and something about the careful way he touched them made my chest tighten. It was during one of these evening returns that I stood in the doorway and watched him for a full minute before he noticed me. He was sitting in Victor's reading chair, afternoon light streaming through the window behind him, catching the silver threads in his hair that hadn't been there when we were young. He was holding a book of poetry I'd assigned to my students, Mary Oliver, I think, though I couldn't see the title from where I stood. But I could see his face, the way he read with complete absorption, and I realized I remembered exactly this expression from college. The way he'd look when he was truly focused on something, eyebrows slightly drawn together, lips parted just enough to suggest he was on the verge of speaking. I remembered the exact sound of his laugh, too, the way it started low in his chest and rose until it became almost musical. I remembered how he drank his coffee, black, always black, even when we were broke and could only afford the terrible instant stuff that tasted like burned water. I remembered the way he walked across campus, hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly hunched against whatever weather the day had brought. Small details I thought I'd forgotten, surfacing now like objects rising to the surface of dark water. These memories felt dangerous in a way I couldn't articulate, not because they were shameful or wrong, but because they came with such vivid intensity, carrying with them the weight of emotions I'd buried so successfully I'd convinced myself they'd never existed at all. We began talking late into the night during his final days with us. It started innocently enough, conversations about old classmates and professors, the kind of reminiscing that's safe because it belongs to people we used to be rather than people we'd become. But gradually, like water finding its way through the smallest cracks, our conversations deepened. We talked about disappointments, about the weight of growing older, the strange mathematics of time that made college feel simultaneously like yesterday and like something that had happened to other people entirely. Adrian told me about relationships that had ended badly, about career moves he regretted, about the way his apartment in Portland sometimes felt like a waiting room for a life that hadn't started yet. I found myself admitting things I'd never said to Victor, never said to Dr. Reeves during our careful therapy sessions. That I sometimes felt like I was living someone else's life, following a script I'd never consciously chosen. That I'd wake up some mornings and spend long minutes in bed, trying to remember what I was supposed to want from the day ahead. That there were moments, standing in the grocery store checkout line, or waiting for a red light to change, or lying next to Victor as he slept, when I felt like an actor who'd forgotten his lines. Adrian listened without trying to fix anything, without offering solutions or reassurances. He just nodded, occasionally saying things like, "I know what you mean," or "I've felt that too." There was something healing in this simple witness, this recognition that the particular loneliness of middle age wasn't mine alone. It was during one of these late-night conversations that I asked the question I'd been circling for days. We were in the kitchen, past midnight, finishing a bottle of wine that had been more full when we'd started talking. The house was completely quiet around us, Emma asleep upstairs, the world reduced to just the two of us and the soft pool of light from the fixture above the kitchen island. "Did you ever feel something for me back then?" The words came out more bluntly than I'd intended, without the careful preamble I'd rehearsed during my evening walks. Adrian went very still. He was holding his wine glass, but not drinking from it, staring into the dark liquid as if it might provide answers to questions he'd never learned how to ask. "It was a different time," he said finally, not looking at me. "That wasn't what I asked." He set down his glass and stood from the kitchen stool, suddenly restless. He walked to the window and looked out at our backyard, though there was nothing to see in the darkness except the vague shapes of the swing set we'd bought for Emma when she was small and the garden beds Victor tended with such methodical care. "I know," he said to the window, "but it's the only answer I can give you right now." The next morning, Victor called from his hotel in Chicago. The conversation was routine: flight times, weather reports, reminders about Emma's college interview the following week. But when Victor asked how things were going with Adrian, I heard myself saying everything was fine, no problems at all, just like old times. The lie came so easily it scared me. Not because it was untrue, though it was, but because it tasted familiar, like something I'd been practicing without realizing it. It happened on a Saturday morning, Adrian's last full day with us. Emma had left early for SAT prep, and the house felt hollow without her weekend energy. I suggested we drive to the coast, to the trail system near Crane Beach where Victor and I sometimes went when we wanted to pretend we were the kind of couple who took romantic walks together. Adrian agreed without enthusiasm, the same careful politeness he'd maintained since our kitchen conversation 3 nights earlier. We drove in relative silence, the radio playing soft jazz that filled the space between us without demanding attention. October had deepened into November during his stay, and the trees along Route 1A were nearly bare, their branches stark against a sky the color of old pewter. The parking area was mostly empty when we arrived. A few dog walkers, an elderly couple sharing coffee from a thermos, a woman in running gear stretching against her car. We pulled on jackets and headed toward the trail that wound through the salt marsh and up into the dunes, where the Atlantic stretched to the horizon like a gray promise. The wind was stronger than I'd expected, carrying the bite of winter and the salt tang of low tide. It made conversation difficult, which seemed appropriate somehow. We walked without talking much, just fragments thrown into the gusts. Comments about the weather, observations about the landscape, the kind of small talk that fills space without revealing anything important. The trail climbed gradually through beach grass and scrub oak, past weathered signs warning about nesting birds and fragile ecosystems. I found myself walking slightly behind Adrian, watching his shoulders move beneath his jacket, the way his hair lifted and settled in the wind. There was something hypnotic about following him along the sandy path, something that reminded me of college walks across campus, when we'd had nowhere particular to go and all the time in the world to get there. About a mile in, the trail crested a small dune and the ocean opened before us, vast and restless under the overcast sky. Adrian stopped walking abruptly, and I nearly ran into him. For a moment we just stood there, looking out at the water, both of us breathing harder than the moderate hike warranted. "This is beautiful," he said, but his voice carried something that suggested he wasn't really talking about the view. I looked at him instead of the ocean. His face was flushed from the wind and the walk, his hair disheveled in a way that made him look younger. There was something in his expression that reminded me of that night senior year when he'd fallen asleep in my bed. The same vulnerable openness that had kept me awake for hours. "Adrian," I said, and my voice cracked on his name like I was 17 again. He turned to look at me, and I saw something shift in his eyes. A decision being made or unmade. "Did you read the letter?" The question came out raw, without the careful phrasing I'd rehearsed during sleepless nights. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the beach grass and the distant crash of waves against the shore. Adrian's face went through several expressions: surprise, recognition, something that might have been relief or regret or both. "Yes," he said finally. The single word hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I was brave enough to cross. I waited, heart hammering against my ribs, for him to say something else, to explain or deny or offer some interpretation that would make this moment safe again. Instead, he just looked at me with an expression I couldn't decode. I waited longer, the silence stretching until it became almost unbearable. Then something broke loose inside me, some dam I'd been maintaining for 20 years without even realizing the effort it required. "I was afraid to say anything," he said when I didn't speak, "because it was true. Then, maybe even now, but I didn't know what to do with it." The words hit me like cold water, shocking in their simplicity. No elaborate explanation or careful qualification. Just the truth, stated as plainly as a weather report. I felt flooded and hollow at the same time, like something essential had been drained out of me and replaced with pure sensation. The wind suddenly seemed louder, the gray sky more vast, the ground beneath my feet less solid than it had been a moment before. We didn't move toward each other, didn't reach out or touch or do any of the things that might have followed such an admission in a different story, with different people, at a different time in our lives. We just stood there on the dune, two middle-aged men looking at each other across 20 years of careful distance, finally acknowledging what we'd both been carrying all this time. "What now?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted an answer. Adrian shook his head slowly, not in negation, but in something like wonder. "I don't know," he said. "I really don't know." We walked back to the car without talking, the revelation settling between us like something heavy we'd both have to carry. The drive home passed in a different kind of silence than the one we'd shared on the way out. Not empty now, but full of things neither of us was ready to name. That afternoon, Adrian spent most of his time in the guest room, packing his things with methodical care. I could hear him moving around up there, the soft sounds of clothes being folded and books being gathered. Emma came home from SAT prep full of complaints about essay questions and timing, and the house filled with her teenage energy. We ordered pizza for dinner, the three of us sitting around the kitchen island like a temporary family, Adrian and I careful not to let our eyes meet for more than a second at a time. That night, I lay in bed next to Victor, who had called to say his flight was delayed and he wouldn't be home until late Sunday. Adrian was just down the hall, probably lying awake in the guest room the same way I was lying awake in the master bedroom. The house felt different around us, charged with electricity I could almost taste. I got up twice to use the bathroom, and both times I paused in the hallway outside the guest room door, listening to the silence beyond it. Once I thought I heard movement, the soft creak of bed springs, but I couldn't be sure. Around 3 in the morning, I found myself standing in the hallway in my pajamas, bare feet on the cold hardwood, my hand raised as if to knock on Adrian's door. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, paralyzed by the weight of everything that might happen if I completed that gesture. I never knocked, never opened the door, never took the 3 steps that would have changed everything that came after. Instead, I went back to my own room and lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sound of my own breathing in the dark. Sunday morning arrived gray and subdued, the kind of November day that feels like an ending before it's properly begun. I woke to the sound of Adrian moving around in the guest room above, the careful footsteps of someone trying not to disturb the rest of the house. Emma was still asleep, her door closed against the adult world and its complicated emotions. The house felt suspended in that particular quiet that comes before significant departures. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, listening to the sounds of Adrian's final preparations. The shower running in the guest bathroom. Footsteps on the stairs. The soft thud of his suitcase being set down in the front hallway. Each sound felt weighted with significance, marking the progression toward a goodbye that would return us to our separate lives, our separate cities, our separate silences. When he appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed in traveling clothes, I felt something lurch in my chest. Not surprise. I'd known this moment was coming since the day he'd arrived. But the reality of it, the finality, hit me with unexpected force. Coffee, I offered, though he was already shaking his head. I should get going, he said. Flight's at noon, and I need to return the rental car. I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. We'd said everything we were going to say yesterday on the dune overlooking the Atlantic. Or perhaps we'd said nothing at all that mattered, and everything else was just the careful dance we'd perfected over 20 years of avoiding the truth. I walked him to the front door, our footsteps echoing in the hallway lined with family photographs. Pictures of Emma growing up, of Victor and me at various anniversaries and celebrations, of vacations and holidays, and all the accumulated evidence of a life lived steadily, predictably, without dramatic upheavals. Adrian glanced at them as we passed, and I wondered what story they told from his perspective, whether they looked like happiness or something else entirely. In the driveway, his rental car sat waiting with the trunk already open, ready to swallow his suitcase and carry him back to his life in Portland. The morning was crisp, our breath visible in small clouds that dissipated quickly in the still air. Somewhere down the street, a dog was barking, and Mr. Henderson was already out tending to his rose bushes, deadheading the last blooms before winter set in properly. We stood beside the car for a moment, neither of us quite ready to complete the ritual of goodbye. Adrian's hands were in his jacket pockets, and he was looking not at me but at the house behind me, as if memorizing it or trying to see it the way it would look in memory. This was good, he said finally, though his voice suggested it was anything but simple. I wanted to say something profound, something that would acknowledge what had passed between us without making it more dramatic than it needed to be. Instead, I heard myself saying something I hadn't planned, words that came from some place deeper than conscious thought. I think I've been sleepwalking most of my life. Adrian looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw recognition in his eyes. Not surprise, but the kind of understanding that comes when someone finally says out loud what you've both been thinking. Then maybe it's time to wake up, he replied. We didn't embrace, didn't make promises about staying in touch or plans to see each other again. We just stood there in my suburban driveway, two men who had finally acknowledged something we'd been carrying for 20 years, and let the weight of that acknowledgement settle between us. Adrian got into the car and started the engine. I stepped back onto the sidewalk and watched him reverse out of the driveway, lift his hand in a brief wave, and drive down Maple Street until the rental car disappeared around the corner toward Route 128 and the airport beyond. I stood in the driveway for a long time after he was gone, listening to the ordinary sounds of a Sunday morning in Lexington. Children playing somewhere nearby, the distant hum of traffic, a lawn mower starting up despite the lateness of the season. Life continuing its predictable rhythms, while something fundamental had shifted inside the careful architecture of my existence. Inside, the house felt different. Not empty, exactly, but hollowed out in places I hadn't noticed could be hollowed. I walked through the rooms Adrian had occupied, straightening things that didn't need straightening, opening windows to air out spaces that smelled faintly of his cologne and the particular scent of disruption. In the guest room, I found the photo album still sitting on the bedside table where he'd left it. I picked it up and opened it to the page he'd been looking at that first afternoon when I'd opened the door too early. Pictures from our senior year. A group shot from someone's birthday party. All of us young and drunk and convinced we'd be friends forever. Another of just Adrian and me, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at whoever was holding the camera. I studied our faces, trying to see what Adrian had seen when he'd looked at these same images. We looked so certain of ourselves, so sure that the future would unfold exactly as we imagined it. I closed the album carefully and placed the letter I'd written 20 years ago between its pages, where it belonged. Where maybe it had always belonged. That evening, Victor returned from Chicago with stories about his conference and complaints about airline delays. We had dinner at the kitchen table, the same table where Adrian and I had sat talking until midnight just days before. Victor asked about the visit, how it had gone, whether Adrian seemed well. I gave him the appropriate answers, the kind of responses that maintained the surface tension of our marriage without revealing the fault lines that had opened beneath. But halfway through the meal, as Victor was telling me about a presentation he'd attended on market volatility, I found myself interrupting him. "I think I need to tell you something," I said, the words coming out quieter than I'd intended. Victor stopped talking and looked at me with the kind of attention he usually reserved for quarterly reports and budget projections. Something in my tone had caught him, some quality he hadn't heard before. I didn't tell him everything. Not about the letter, or the moment on the dune when Adrian had admitted the truth we'd both been carrying. Not about standing in the hallway at 3 in the morning, paralyzed by possibility. But I told him enough. About feeling like I'd been sleepwalking. About questioning whether the life we'd built together was the life either of us actually wanted. About the particular loneliness that comes from sharing a bed with someone who doesn't know the questions that keep you awake at night. Victor listened without interrupting, his face cycling through expressions I'd never seen before. Not anger, which I'd expected, but something more complicated. Relief, maybe, mixed with a recognition that suggested he'd been waiting for this conversation longer than either of us had realized. When I finished talking, we sat in silence for a long time, the dinner cooling between us, both of us staring at our hands rather than at each other. Finally, Victor said, "I've been wondering when you were going to say something like this." The dam had cracked, and there was no going back to the careful silence we'd maintained for so many years. The changes came slowly, like seasons shifting without you noticing until suddenly the light falls differently, and you realize everything has transformed around you. By February, Victor and I had moved into separate bedrooms. Not out of anger or resentment, but out of a kind of clarity that felt like relief. We'd spent so many years carefully maintaining the fiction of intimacy that neither of us had noticed how exhausting it had become. Emma left for college in August, choosing a school in Vermont that specialized in environmental science and activism. She hugged us both goodbye in the driveway, the same driveway where I'd watched Adrian's rental car disappear 9 months earlier, and I saw in her face the kind of excitement that comes from finally being allowed to discover who you are when no one is watching. Victor and I stood together waving until her car disappeared around the corner, and then we went inside to a house that felt cavernous without her energy filling it. The quiet was different now. Not the careful silence we'd maintained for years, but something more honest. We still had dinner together most evenings, still shared the morning coffee routine, still asked each other about our days. But we'd stopped pretending these rituals meant more than they did. We'd become roommates who genuinely liked each other, who shared a history and a daughter and a mortgage, but who no longer felt the need to perform marriage for each other's benefit. Dr. Reeves retired in the spring, and we stopped going to couples therapy by mutual agreement. There was nothing left to fix, nothing left to work on. We'd simply grown into two different people who happened to live in the same house, and somehow that felt more honest than anything we'd achieved in all those years of conscious effort. I kept the guest room empty, not as a shrine to Adrian's visit, but because it felt important to have space in the house that belonged to possibility rather than routine. Sometimes I would stand in the doorway and remember that afternoon when I'd opened the door too early, when our eyes had met across the small room and something had shifted that could never be shifted back. But the memory no longer carried the weight of regret or longing. It felt more like gratitude for a moment that had changed everything, even if I couldn't have predicted how. In November, almost exactly a year after Adrian's visit, I wrote him a letter. Not the careful, anguished letter I'd written in college, but something simpler. I told him about the changes in my life, about Victor and me finding our way to a kind of friendship that worked better than our marriage ever had. I told him about Emma's first semester, about the woodworking projects I'd finally finished in the garage, about the way the house felt both emptier and more spacious without the constant effort of maintaining appearances. I didn't tell him I loved him, because I wasn't sure that was the right word for what had passed between us. I didn't ask him to visit again, because some moments can't be repeated without losing their power. I just thanked him for helping me understand the difference between being settled and being alive. I wrote the letter by hand on good paper. The kind of letter people used to write before email made every communication feel temporary. When I finished, I sealed it in an envelope and placed it in the drawer of my desk, next to the letter I'd never sent 20 years ago. Maybe I'd send this one someday. Maybe I wouldn't. The writing itself felt like enough. On a Saturday in December, when the first real snow of winter was falling outside, I drove to the coast where Adrian and I had walked that day in November. The trail was different in winter, covered in snow that muffled every sound except the distant crash of waves against the frozen shore. I walked the same path we'd taken, past the weathered signs and through the beach grass that stood brittle and brown against the white dunes. When I reached the spot where we'd stopped, where he'd finally admitted the truth we'd both been carrying, I stood for a long time looking out at the gray Atlantic. The wind was fierce, carrying snow and salt and the promise of storms to come. I pulled my jacket tighter and breathed deeply, feeling the cold air fill my lungs completely. I thought about the conversation with Victor the night Adrian left, how we'd sat at the kitchen table and finally acknowledged the spaces between us that no amount of therapy or good intentions could bridge. I thought about Emma, probably studying in her dorm room in Vermont, becoming the person she was meant to be without the weight of her parents' unspoken disappointments. I thought about Adrian, somewhere in Portland, living his life in ways I could only imagine. But mostly I thought about myself, standing on a dune overlooking the Atlantic, no longer sleepwalking through the days, but fully present in each moment, even the difficult ones. Especially the difficult ones. The snow was falling harder when I walked back to the car, covering my footprints almost as soon as I made them. By the time I reached the parking area, there was no evidence I'd been there at all, except for the warmth in my chest and the clarity that comes from finally understanding the difference between the life you've lived and the life you're living. I drove home slowly, windshield wipers beating a steady rhythm against the snow. The house on Maple Street looked smaller than I remembered, its windows glowing yellow against the winter afternoon. Victor's car was in the driveway, and I could see him moving around in the kitchen, probably starting dinner. I sat in my car for a moment before going inside, looking at this house where I'd spent 15 years learning how to be a husband and a father, where I'd folded laundry and graded papers and maintained the careful architecture of a settled life. It was a good house, filled with good memories and honest effort. But it was no longer a place where I was sleeping through my own existence. I got out of the car and walked up the front steps, snow crunching under my feet. Before I opened the door, I paused and took one more breath of winter air, feeling it sharp and clean in my lungs. Some doors opened too early. Others, just in time.